people are supposed to be here that are not here. I don't know what's happened to them. Just before we start on the text, we'll be starting on the second article tonight on page 138. I've asked Dr. Bonnet to say a couple of words, just arising out of a conversation we had a couple of days ago, and I thought, well, just why doesn't he say this to you? I could say it, but he's put it so well, I said, you're going to say that to the class. Please.
Right.
Well, these were just a few passing thoughts that something I've always taught my students when I was teaching at Niagara University, and it's a very simple insight, but it's a critical one. You have no philosophy. You know no philosophy except that which you yourself understand. Anything else is merely a recitation of history. I would tell my students in metaphysics, I'd say, you could go through this whole course. And when you get done, you could repeat everything you learned in the course, and all you would be able to say that you knew is what Bonnet's metaphysics was. But that doesn't mean you understood any metaphysics. You only understand it if you yourself can see that it's true and can see why it is true and why it cannot be otherwise. Otherwise, you're just repeating somebody else's thoughts. That's one of the problems with a history of philosophy. I confess I never was exceedingly enthusiastic about the study of history, because largely it's a restatement of other people's mistakes. It wasn't things that I myself was convicted of, and certainly just as when you study, for example, chemistry, you don't study the history of chemistry. You don't go in there and learn what phlogiston theory is all about, do you? Or how to turn base metals into gold? I mean, that'd be nice if you could do it. That's of historical interest, but that's not the truth. You study the sciences. You study, general chemistry, organic chemistry, nuclear chemistry, qualitative analysis. You study the specific disciplines because they tell you the truth, as best we know it, about chemical reality. And the same thing's true in philosophy. That's why Dr. Waters has been conducting courses in philosophical psychology, ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, because these are the sciences in philosophy. History may be interesting, but history itself is not the science which is constituted of in philosophy. So I'd always remind my students, and eventually they got the message, they could repeat it by heart. You understand, you know no philosophy except that which you yourself understand. You see it yourself, you see how it reduces to the first principles that are immediately known upon simple reflection of the terms. Just the initial encounter with being. And you can reduce it to that. If you can't do that, you don't understand it. I've always thought, you read somebody's tome that is so impressive because it's so complex. It's so hard to understand, you think it must have been written by a genius. That's what always struck me about Immanuel Kant. It's just unintelligible. But, if somebody really knows what they're talking about, they can reduce it to terms that are simply understandable. If they can't do that, one becomes suspicious they don't understand it themselves. And I've become somewhat suspicious of Kant for that very reason. Yes, sir?
Do you have to accept it in addition to understand it?
You mean accept it before you come to understand it?
No, accept it after you come to understand it.
If you come to understand it, you have accepted it in the act of understanding it. Do you believe that 2 and 2 are 4?
I accept it.
You just believe it? That's all? Somebody could we have taught you that 2 and 2 is 5? Would you believe that if we raised you right?
I wouldn't accept it.
No, because you're not accepting it on my word. You're accepting it because you understand it. You understand the nature of 2 and its relationship to 4. So it's not a matter of accepting it. It's not a matter of belief. It's not a matter of subjective reaction. It is a matter of you see the truth of the statements themselves, and in philosophy you can reduce them to first principles or immediate experience that is undoubtable and undeniable because it is immediate. And if you can't do that, you don't know what you're talking about. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's often the case. And as I say, that's what I suspect with Immanuel Kant. You'll notice one of the things that always struck me reading through the Critique of Pure Reason, he never talks about things like dogs and trees and horses. There's a reason for that in the content of the philosophy itself. But certainly anybody who really knows what he's talking about ought to be able to relate what he's talking about to the things in the world around you, the things that are immediately known, and that can be explained in terms that almost anybody can grasp. It is true, as Dr. Waters pointed out previously, only about 1 in 12 people have a philosophical mind. I'll grant that. Nonetheless, if you have a philosophical mind, even so, you have to see things yourself, or you're just repeating what others have said. So that's all I have to say on that insight. I'll turn the class back to the master.
Thank you.
Well, now we'll progress in understanding the nature of sciences, and in particular the distinction between various sciences. So page 138, whether sacred doctrine is a science. And St. Thomas is trying to show, well, in showing that sacred science, sacred theology in other words, is a science, at the same time he's dealing with sciences in general. And he shows here that there are two kinds of sciences. Those which see their principles immediately, and those which borrow their principles from another science. For instance, this kind of thing. Mathematics will give us, say, geometry, because there's two kinds of sciences in mathematics. There's the discrete science and there's the continuous science. For instance, geometry is a continuous, and discrete, in other words, all bits broken up, as it were, that's algebra and arithmetic. But then when you come to things like astronomy or music, they borrow the principles from mathematics. Astronomy is no less a science for borrowing those principles. And astronomy uses geometry all the time. So it's still a science, even though it borrows the principles from another. Well, likewise with sacred science, we borrow the principles from God in Revelation. He revealed the principles. Doesn't make it any less a science. I mentioned this, that somebody in the Academy of Sciences raised this after I delivered a paper on the distinction of sciences, raised this that, a lot of people wouldn't regard those, philosophy, theology, etc., wouldn't regard them as sciences. Well, that's all very well. I said to biologists, I've said to chemists, all right, are you doing science? What is science? You might be working in a laboratory for 30 years and not do one act of science. Unless you find the cause of something, you see something in its causes, you're not doing science yet. You're only preparing for science. So you can be working in a laboratory with test tubes, and like a niece of mine, I said to her, what is science? Oh, it's all about, about animals and plants and things and all about this, all about, well, the zoo has animals and plants. Is that a science? Is a zoo a science? And we're eating steak. Is that a science? Not until you find the causes of something. That's what the nature of a science is. Certain knowledge through causes. The matter this gentleman brought up, I can see your point there. What I think is in your mind, that you might still grasp it, and you might understand it thoroughly. But you don't yet accept it, do you? Not till you see the truth of it.
I understood his proposition that 2 and 2 equal 5, but I didn't accept it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right, yeah. Well, the point is, you until you see the truth of something, you may never accept it. People accept a lot of things, but it's pure faith. There's so much faith. Even in chemistry, how much faith is there? Where one man is depending upon another one who's given him a whole lot of matter. And you'll take a big textbook like inorganic or organic chemistry. You say, well, I've never determined that boiling point. I've never determined this. I've never done that. 90% of science is faith. They don't seem to realize it, the scientists. Until you see the truth of something, and that is necessarily true. So your objection was a good one, I think. You may see it, you may understand it, you don't necessarily accept it. Not till you see that it is true. Then you'll find you're forced to accept it. When you see the evidence of it, it's truth. Well, this is what St. Thomas is pointing out here. he says, by the way, the second objection to science is not of individuals. Never forget that. Science depends upon universals, the very thing that people will sometimes deny. The chemist is not interested in this piece of silver, he's only interested in silver. And what they do in science is induction. Now there's deduction where you deduce from principles, but there's induction where you go from individuals up to a universal. For instance, does iron conduct heat? Well, this piece did, this piece did, this piece did, and so did this piece. So they draw a conclusion. Every piece does. And if you don't have enough individuals, it can become very suspect. You have to have a sufficient enumeration of parts, as it's called. You have to have a sufficient number of experiments. And you might be doing that all day long. You might have students all taking the conductivity of iron with electricity or heat, and finally somebody draws a conclusion, therefore every piece conducts electricity and heat.
In the medieval period, they thought that all crows were black, and there were some albino crows.
And all swans were white till they
Black
came
swan.
to Australia. Found black swans, which have white under their wings, by the way. But I've seen so many swans flying over in the evening on a lake during the day, all black. And I saw in the botanical gardens, of course, and other places, white swans. But anyway, science is not of individuals. It's just a passing thing, he says. And in the objection is, every science, I've underlined this, proceeds from self-evident principles. My mouth is watering on account of those darn cookies which I'm not supposed to eat anyway. Now, we must bear in mind that there are two kinds of sciences. There are some which proceed from principles known by the natural light of the intellect, such as arithmetic and geometry and the like. There are also some which proceed from principles by the light of a higher science. Thus, the science of optics proceeds from principles established by geometry. So, there's a science about God, which he sees. He sees himself. He sees himself imitable, and he could order it into existence. He sees himself imitable in this manner, so he orders it into existence. There's one. Sees himself, thank you very much, in that manner, he orders another one into existence. There's another one there. So, but that's just ordering individuals into existence. But he knows the universal, mankind, and what man is, and how this one imitates mankind, or is a reflection of mankind, if you like to put it that way. But the important thing is principles. All sciences will ultimately reduce to some kind of principles. In experimental science, reducible to observation, the principles of observation. It may be a higher science that gives it its principles, but it's a science nonetheless, because it draws conclusions. And an objection that was raised there in this article, the individual facts are not treated in sacred doctrine because it is concerned with them principally. They are rather introduced as examples to be followed in our lives. So, in sacred science, sacred theology, just as in philosophy, we use individuals merely to illustrate a point. We don't have to use individuals and say, well, that's not a science because it treats of individuals. So that point should be fairly clear, namely that there are different kinds of sciences. And the fact that sacred science borrows its principles from God himself in revelation, that doesn't make it any the less a science. So on page 139, whether sacred doctrine is one science, summing that up, this is what he's saying, that the very aspect that the science argues from, the formal character is what we should be saying, shows that with respect to all the things in sacred theology, they're all referred to God. That's what unifies everything. It's all one science because it's speaking with respect to God. Other sciences don't. They have different ways of referring to things. So I answer that on this third article. The unity of a power or habit is to be gauged by its object, not indeed in its material aspect, but as regards the formality under which it is an object. In other words, with respect to sight, we're talking about everything in sight is referred to colour. Materially, it might be man, it might be a dog, it might be a tree, it might be a house or a stone. But formally, or with respect to sight, the very formal character of it is colour. Colour gives it its characteristic. So, it's one science because, sacred theology, because it's referred to God and the revelation. It has unity from that. So, it's the formality under which it is an object. Well, the formality under which, say, a tree is an object for hearing would be the rustling of the leaves and the footsteps of a man. So hearing refers to all those different things, but it's that one formal characteristic that is the object of the power of hearing. Likewise with sight. Acts, habits, and powers. The act of sight, the power of sight, and a habit, such as chemistry, we call those habits. They're all unified by their formal object. All those things have their formal, they're all distinguished, by their formal character. Namely, what is the object? What's the object of chemistry? What's the object of sight? What's the object of a power? What's the object of an act? All distinguished by their object. So, now in reply to objection 2, oh, by the way, reply to objection 1. Sacred doctrine does not treat of God and creatures equally, but of God primarily and of creatures only so far as they are referable to God, as their beginning or end. Hence the unity of this science is not impaired. In reply to objection 2, nothing prevents inferior powers or habits from being diversified by objects which yet agree with one another in coming together under a higher power or habit, because the higher power or habit regards its own object under a more universal formality. So the one unifying thing is the fact that it's revelation from God. So that higher power is this, that it comes under the very knowledge of God, about God, which He has, and He gives us those principles. But that's his is the higher power. But also sacred theology is a higher power too, and higher than, say, for instance, philosophy. Because under philosophy we consider all different subjects, and all different objects rather, and that gives us many sciences. But sacred theology, it all comes together in one science because it's got all that one characteristic, namely its principles are found in God itself. We're just getting a peep into that. So, reading that through, I don't know, have any of you had any difficulty reading these articles? Have you tried to read any of them yet? The ones we, perhaps not before we've dealt with it here. So they're all these various things we consider in other sciences, they are included under sacred science as under one science, precisely because the principles are all found ultimately in God. Now, in this reply to objection 2, it gives an example there. The example needs a little explaining. It has common sense. Now, that doesn't mean exactly what we think it means with everyday language in English. We have a certain sense. Then we have sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. We call this the common sense, or it's called in Latin the sensus communis, the common sense. But we don't use the term usually. I don't know why the translators use that here. I suppose they directly translated the Latin term. But we usually speak about it as the unitive sense, or the sense consciousness, because that's where consciousness is. You see, sight is, say, a power we have, and this makes us conscious of a sight. There are 4 internal senses: the imagination, and the cogitative power, and sensitive memory. So what happens is, all those forms, colours that come in through sight, this makes us conscious of those acts of sight, and tells us that we're not imagining it. Sometimes when we get sick, it's a sign of sickness, where a person can't distinguish things because they can't distinguish between what they're seeing and what they're imagining. Well, sense consciousness makes us, it's also called the central sense, makes us conscious that we are imagining, or conscious that we are seeing. It can unify the senses. It can distinguish them. This is a very powerful sense, but it makes us conscious of our sensations. Well, everything that goes here, as Thomas is explaining there, all comes under one power here. The senses cannot reflect. We can reflect. We can say, yes, I'm imagining, aren't I? I'm doing this, or I'm doing that, something else. Or I can think about my thoughts. What did I think about yesterday? We can reflect over things. The senses can't. It means they can't bend back over themselves. So this central sense must be there in order to make us conscious of all these other things. Conscious that what I'm seeing out there is what I'm touching, or conscious of what I'm imagining, or conscious of something I'm remembering from yesterday, etc., etc. So that's what he's talking about, the common sense here. It could throw you off if I didn't explain that to you. Hence the common sense, although one power, extends to all the object of the 5 senses. So that's pretty clear, methinks. So he's dealing with all these aspects of science which don't appear in textbooks, rarely appear, any of it, in any textbooks. So, especially, I'm talking about science textbooks, of course. Now he asks the question, don't forget now the objections. The objection 1, let's read that first, and then we'll look again at the reply. It seems that sacred doctrine is not one science, for according to the philosopher, that is to say, Aristotle. He always speaks about the philosopher, he's speaking about Aristotle. When he talks about the commentator, he's often speaking about Averroes, an Arabic philosopher. When he speaks about the rabbi, he's talking about Moses Maimonides. He's got all these names for these fellows. And what does he talk about Denis the Areopagite? Denis the Great. Only one philosopher he said called the Great, and that was Denis. Who is he? I don't know. The World Authority, I spoke to him in 1983 in Montreal at the World Congress of Philosophers. Raymond Klebansky is considered the leading scholar in the world, and I said, Professor Klebansky, I heard you're on the track of finding out who Denis the Areopagite is. He said, Je n'en sais rien. I know nothing about it. I have no idea who he is. Nobody knows. Very strange story about him. I've related to classes beforehand. Up till the 15th century, they used to think it was the Areopagite who's mentioned in a letter by St. Paul. I think it's the letter of the Romans, if I remember correctly. He says there, Denis the Areopagite was present somewhere, St. Paul says. Now, suddenly there appears these works written in Greek, which were entitled something, I've forgotten now the title, have various works all go into the one volume. And it's by Denis the Areopagite. Well, who is Denis the Areopagite? They said it was the fellow in the 1st century. Now, critical scholarship started in the 15th century on literature, and the Germans particularly were very thorough in this. And by internal evidence, namely examining the documents themselves, they suddenly realized he's talking about monasteries. There were no monasteries in the 1st century, not before the 3rd century. So it couldn't have been Denis the Areopagite. Areopagia, by the way, is a kind of a a district municipal council or something like that in the ancient world. And he was called an Areopagite. So they found there was internal evidence. There were no monasteries in those days. Second point, the Greek he was using wasn't used that time. There's a modification of Greek. The Greek's about the 5th or 6th century Greek. Now, external evidence. Nobody refers to him before about the 6th century. And in those days, they all referred to each other. And nobody refers to him before that. And then there has no appearance of anything else that concerned with him before the 6th century. So we know he lived at the end of the 5th or the beginning of the 6th. I have his complete works in French and some bits in English. But words like theoarchy, hierarchy, words like that in English we got from Dennis, the Areopagite. And St. Thomas calls him the Great, and he's the only one he ever called the Great. He would probably kiss the feet of Aristotle, but he still doesn't call him the Great. He just calls him the philosopher. So, forgotten where we were now.
Objection 1.
Yes, objection 1. Yeah, the philosopher. There we are. It seems that sacred doctrine is not one science, for according to the philosopher, that science is one which treats only of one class of subjects. But the creator and the creature, both of whom are treated in sacred doctrine, cannot be grouped together under one class of subjects. Therefore, sacred doctrine is not one science. The reply, sacred doctrine does not treat of God and creatures equally, but of God primarily, and of creatures only insofar as they are referable to God as their beginning or end. It's like there's a 2 left out there. Hence, the unity of this science is not impaired. So I think if you read that through, you'll find you make sense of it. Now, whether the 4th article, whether sacred doctrine is a practical science. It seems that sacred doctrine is a practical science, for practical science is that which ends in action, according to the philosopher. But sacred doctrine is ordained to action. Be ye doers of the word and not hearers only. So it seems that it's not a practical science. I'm sorry, I'm saying it wrongly. It seems that sacred doctrine is a practical science, for a practical science is that which ends in action. The end of a science always determines the thing. The end of a speculative science is truth, to know truth. But of a practical science is action. One tells you how to know, and the other tells you how to do. That's what it amounts to. So, further, sacred doctrine is divided into the old and the new law. But law belongs to moral science, which is a practical science. I don't know why this is happening. I'm trying to stop it. But every time I'm typing something lately, it seems to come up. Periods are put in there all the time. You see a period right in the middle of a sentence and it throws the sentence off. I don't know whether it's my heavy touch on the typing that I'm doing or what it is.
Brandy.
I just recently discovered ginger brandy.
I thought you said brandy.
That's good for you.
Man, I now know what heaven's like.
Good. It would be good if it wasn't good for you.
Now, on the contrary, every practical science is concerned with the things man can do, as moral science is concerned with human acts, and architecture with buildings. But sacred science is chiefly concerned with God, who is rather the maker of man. Therefore, it is not a practical, but a speculative science. Now, a speculative science is one in which we know for the sake of knowing. We know for sake of knowing. But a practical science, we know for the sake of doing. Keep that at the back of your mind. So, I want you to do 2 things, or 3 things. One is to understand what the matter is here. The other one is to note how the whole thing is structured. An article is structured in St. Thomas, which was a style used in his day. So there's objection 1, then objection 2, then always on the contrary. Now he's showing how it is known, that it is this kind of thing. So on the contrary is sort of an authoritative argument, if you like. Every practical science is concerned with the things man can do, as moral science is concerned with human acts. Now here he's not using, if you look up at the top there, on the contrary, in the third article, Holy Scripture speaks of it as one science. And he gives an authoritative argument there. But when it comes to this other one, here he's arguing it out just himself. Every practical science is concerned with the things man can do, as moral science is concerned with human acts, and architecture with buildings. But sacred doctrine is chiefly concerned with God, who is rather the maker of man. Therefore, it is not a practical but a speculative science. So, he says, now comes the teaching that he's giving of himself. I answer that. Sacred doctrine being one, extends to things which belong to the different philosophical sciences. In other words, they're all unified in sacred theology, but they're multiplied into different sciences in philosophy. We saw that earlier. Why? Because it considers each the same formal aspect, namely, so far as they can be known. I think that's meant to be. Goodness me. As they can be known through the divine light. Hence, although among the philosophical sciences some are speculative and some are practical, others practical, nevertheless, sacred doctrine includes both, as God by one and the same science knows both himself and his works. Practical science is ethics and poetics. Poetics is the philosophy of art, the philosophy of aesthetics, or the philosophy of engineering, if you like. But the speculative science, we have the philosophy of nature, logic, and metaphysics. So, still, it is more speculative than practical, sacred science, that is, because it is more concerned with divine things than with human acts. Though even of these acts it treats inasmuch as man is ordained by them to the perfect knowledge of God, in which consists eternal beatitude. And this is sufficient answer to the questions. So it is, most formally, it is a speculative science, but the practical science is included in sacred theology, because he makes that point very well. But his idea is to get to us the reference to God, that everything is included under one supreme aspect, namely our relativity to God, relationship to God in that science. That's what he's pointing out. So it's a good lesson with all sciences. So you can say there's the chemist, and there's the practical chemist. They have applied chemistry and applied chemistry. But chemistry will be the pure theoretical, the speculative science. But then there's a practical application here. The same with medicine. It has been said, there's a lovely treatment in Woodbury on this, that there's the sort of speculative science of anatomy and physiology. But there is a practical science too, in say, with surgery and that sort of thing, and the application of art in applying medicine to illnesses and all that sort of thing. So now we come to the fifth article, whether sacred doctrine is nobler than other sciences. It seems that sacred doctrine is not nobler than other sciences, for the nobility of a science depends on its certitude. But other sciences, the principles of which cannot be doubted, seem to be more certain than sacred doctrine. For its principles, namely articles of faith, can be doubted. Therefore, other sciences seem to be nobler. Seems to be a powerful argument, doesn't it? Distinction between knowing and believing. And one can deny these things. Therefore, they don't seem to be utterly certain, or at least they're not certain to some person, because that depends upon the intellect of the person. Now, objection 2. Further, it is the part of a lower science to draw upon a higher, as music draws upon arithmetic. But sacred doctrine does draw upon the philosophical sciences. For Jerome observes in his epistle to Manius that the ancient doctors so enriched their books with the doctrines and thoughts of the philosophers that thou knowest not what more to admire in them, their profane erudition or their scriptural learning. Therefore, sacred doctrine is inferior to other sciences. There are the objections. Now he responds, on the contrary, other sciences are called the handmaidens of this one. That's what philosophy's always been called, the handmaiden of theology. Wisdom sent her maids to invite to the tower. I'm being punished tonight. I had a couple of those cookies there, and they make my mouth water and I can't talk properly, so you'll forgive me if I do slobber a little bit. There's only one thing I found worse than that. When I was teaching at Niagara, I had an hour between two classes I had to give, and I'd have a quick lunch, and often I just loved peanuts. I'd have some peanuts, and I went to the classroom, I was practically spluttering them out, to the great amusement of the students. I couldn't talk after eating peanuts, so I never eat peanuts when going to give a lecture. I remember the day we were coming out of the Botanical Gardens in Sydney, and I met two friends, and they're walking along with a big bag of shelled peanuts. You've heard this before, haven't you? Shelled peanuts. Oh, hi fellas. I was 20-something, I think. And would you like a peanut? Yeah, sure. I took the bag, tore it right down the bottom, and said, I want this one. What do we do with the bloody peanuts now? I thought they were going to kill me. Dear, oh dear, yes, that's the one I want, the one at the bottom. So, whether sacred doctrine is nobler than other sciences. As I said, remember, when Thomas objects to his doctrines, he always goes to the kernel of an objection. And there's something like, in one of his articles, 17 objections, 17 counter-objections. Then he deals with the argument. Then he does the solution to the first objections and solution to the replies to the counter. And if you ever could want to see something which is a perfect hierarchy of architectural study, it's magnificent. Father Grabman wrote a very great scholar, lived somewhere, I think up in the middle of last century, and I have his work on this, and he calls it an architectural masterpiece, the Summa, which goes something like this. The first part is the procession of creatures. So he'll deal with angelic beings, he'll deal with human beings, then animals, then plants, and then the mineral world, like that. It's a hierarchy of development. The procession of everything from God. Then he'll deal with man struggling in this life. Then he'll deal with the return to God. It's a magnificent structure, but if you can get the idea of the structure first when you start to study it, just look at the outlines. Most books have something like this. The first 26 articles deal with God. Then all the creative order after that. Magnificent treatise. And if you want to deal with something like the operation of the human intellect or the freedom of the will, you'll find it there. So, it seems that sacred doctrine is not nobler than other sciences, for the nobility of a science depends on its certitude. But other sciences, the principles of which cannot be doubted, seem to be more certain than sacred doctrine. For its principles, namely articles of faith, can be doubted. Therefore, other sciences seem to be nobler. So that sort of is the crunch objection as far as I'm concerned. Other sciences are called the handmaidens of this one. Now he gives the answer. I answer that since this science is partly speculative and partly practical, it transcends all other sciences, speculative and practical. Now I've put a little a next to this. Now one speculative science is said to be nobler than another either by reason of its greater certitude or by reason of the higher dignity of its subject matter. In both these respects, this science surpasses other speculative sciences. In point of greater certitude, note that. Remember, authority is the poorest of all arguments, my friends. Chemistry is not true because somebody said it. A certain philosophy is not false because Marx said it. So, you take the evidence to find certitude and falsity, truth and falsity. But here, this is an exemption. Why? Because of the authority of God himself. Nobody can be a better authority than he can about himself and about us. In both these respects, this science surpasses other speculative sciences. In point of greater certitude, because other sciences derive their certitude from the natural light of human reason, which can err, whereas this derives its certitude from the light of the divine knowledge, which cannot err. In point of the higher dignity of its subject matter, because this science treats chiefly of those things which by their sublimity transcend human reason, while other sciences consider only those things which are within reason's grasp. So on both counts, the certitude is there because of the authority of God. And of course, remember, what we're talking about presumes the articles of the, what are they called again? The preliminary articles, there's another term used. Pardon?
Articles of Precept.
No, in faith, the preamble fide, that's right. The preambles to faith. The preambles to faith. In other words, first we prove the existence of God. Then we prove the nature of the human intellect, and therefore the immortality of the soul. Then we prove, etc., 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 called apologetics. And that's the beginning part of the science of sacred theology. But these things are philosophically treated, and you defend human reason and defend the philosophical conclusions, such as God necessarily exists. We defend that. So those preambles to faith, preambula fidei, the preambles of faith as they're called in Latin, we deal with them first to establish there is a God. But to prove that there's a God by proving out of the Bible, one fellow said to me some years ago, I said, I can prove there's a God, absolute, with utter certitude. He said, no good. He said, I don't believe in the Bible. That was a silly objection. But I said, well, what's that got to do with it? Well, that's what you're going to use, aren't you? I said, no. I said, you're going to eat turkey tonight, aren't you? And he said, no, I'm not. I said, well, I can guess as good as you can. I just want to poke out just to show him how silly he was, guessing. So there we are. It's higher dignity, greater certitude. Now, little b, of the practical sciences, that one is nobler, which is ordained to a more final end, as political science is nobler than military science. Because military science is meant to defend the body politic. So political science is dealing with the common good and things like that. For the good of the army is directed to the good of the state. But the purpose of this science, insofar as it is practical, is eternal beatitude, eternal happiness, to which, as to an ultimate end, the ends of all the practical sciences are directed. Hence it is clear that from every standpoint it is nobler than other sciences. All the other sciences are really practical sciences, help us in society, etc., in order to enable us to achieve our ultimate end. It's a pity a few governments didn't realise that. The ultimate end of a civil order is really beatitude, happiness for man. I've had people say to me, well, fun, that's what life's all about, isn't it? What a silly statement. I've never said that to the persons, though I was tempted to on a number of occasions. But that's what life's all about. I have one friend who is older than I am. I'm 105, and I think he's 110. What's so funny, young lady? But he keeps saying to me, it's time you gave up and had fun in life. Well, this is my fun, friends. Sharing it with you is a great joy, believe me. So, but all those sciences, all the practical sciences, are to enable us to live. In fact, if we were in a sensible climate, civilian climate, we would be having a lot of time on our hands that we could enjoy having discussion. Just imagine if we could conduct these courses and have fun all along the whole year, an afternoon, 2 afternoons a week, an afternoon or a whole day or something like that, and just enjoy it, instead of being wage slaves, which we are now. You're paid a wage and then you're expected to work 40 hours, etc., etc. I was in the middle of the Indian Ocean in 1962 on the SS Strathmore, its last voyage. There were Greek and English migrants. I was coming from Greece, just lucky enough to catch that ship. We got into a conversation, a group of us on the decks. The new secretary for the Australian Council of Churches was on that ship. Clive had come from University of Oxford and a few other people. We just found great joy in just having discussions on a deck, going through the tropics. You know, we'd hear suddenly the siren of the ship going, we're passing Christmas Island or something else, and you could see figures running along the sand, all waving. But coming through the Indian Ocean, I presented a paper, is a one-day working week possible? And I defended that. I published a paper in which I show the defence. It's called The Two Faces of Capitalism. I sent it out to you recently, I'll send it out again if you want it. The Two Faces of Capitalism. It is my contention that with modern instruments, etc., if we had a proper organisation of society, 1 day a week is all that would be necessary. In the Middle Ages, 2.5 days were all necessary to earn your living. 2.5 days. That's been defended by Dr. Pius. You have his book. I'm really surprised to see this book. How you got that, I don't know.
There's only 2 available in the world.
Are there?
Yeah.
Well, I happen to have about 3. I didn't know you were going to go. Oh, it's okay, thank you. Value, normal and morbid. I have the great joy of saying when the Aquinas Academy was established in Sydney, Dr. Pierce and I were there on the first night, and we were the last. We were there for years. So many years, 20 years or something I studied there. I don't know, and taught there. Anyway, I have about 3 copies. I was given them by Dr. Pierce for libraries, and I found it very difficult to find a library that I could give it to. One man read in the Centre for Economic and Social Justice, read my paper, The Two Faces of Capitalism, and he's got Dr. Pierce's other big work, which is a thorough work on economics, the science of economics. He said, I think your work's better than Pierce. I got it from Pierce, I told him. Anyway, but these practical sciences would enable us to obtain greater happiness in the world, in this life and the next. Too much.
Just one question. Would that include farmers as well, that 2.5 days of work?
Well, in those days, they were practically all farmers. 2.5 days. But they only had to work that. They worked on the 3/8. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, and 8 hours of enjoyment or necessities. Yes, well, the leisure is required for all that. Aristotle used the term leisure as not loafing time, but time to practice all these other things that we need to practice. I have documentation for these things, by the way. I've had students research them. I've got documentation of what happened in the Middle Ages. They had something like 156 public holidays. Public holidays. And sometimes that would go on, they'd have festivals. Might go on for 2 or 3 days.
But wasn't poverty rampant then?
No, it was proven, what's his name, in England, that they had everything made of wool, furniture even covered with wool. They had everything, and they needed nothing. I'll bring the documents in. I'll bring them in.
They were also well educated.
Well educated. They studied the trivium first. They would study logic, rhetoric, grammar. Each was calculated to do a certain thing. But the object was, up to the age of 16, to train people to think for themselves. Then 17, they'd launch into the quadrivium. They'd go into other things. And by the way, all of this in Latin. They knew Latin. In England, as, what's his name? I can't think of his name for a second. The 13th, the greatest of centuries. He wrote that book. Walsh, Father Walsh, thank you. He says that even the housewives even wrote their grocery bills in Latin. A dozen over. An ovum is an egg. A dozen over. It gives you examples of that. So, no, there wasn't rampant poverty. There's been a terrible, disloyal, or should I say treacherous treatment of those periods by many people. It's very interesting. I've seen very good objective stuff from many historians. One historian says, oh, it was an era in which you could smell them coming, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, trivial stuff like that they'd talk about. God, you've only got to go to London and England in summer, you can do that. You don't have to be afraid. They don't like Australians coming to London because we had to take baths every day or showers every day. They didn't like that. It's the landladies of certain places that I stayed in. Anyway, no, but you can find that in lots of big cities. You don't in Australia, incidentally, but I know lots of people who are in London and want to get out of London because that they said the BO is enormous there. Anyway, where were we? So the practical sciences are the ones that need terrible overhaul. Ethics. Don't teach the science of ethics. One of my colleagues at Niagara University taught this. Abortion, capital punishment, euthanasia. That was his ethics course. Read 2 essays for and 2 essays against each one. That's the extent of your course. What about establishing all the principles and working on the whole systematic order of the science itself? No, unknown to him. However, he tried. Might have been the way he was taught philosophy. As for another friend, I remember John gave us a lecture one night. Do you remember that? And taught us how he was taught in the Jesuits. My God, I couldn't believe it. It was terrible the way they taught philosophy. It's been shockingly taught in seminaries and many other places. As for Australian universities, a bomb would be the only way to correct most of what they do. So, there he's dealing with the speculative science first, and on that score, it's the noblest of science. Then the practical science, it is also nobler than other sciences. Every standpoint. Because it deals with the ultimate end. It's the one that deals with the ultimate end. Just as any other science, shipbuilding. You've got to have the architects who designed the ship. The architect who designed the ship has to think of this. What's it going to be used for? For battle? For transportation of goods? So the man that deals with the ultimate end in the practical order, because practical order is always about ends, remember? The one that deals with the utmost ultimate end, there's the most noble science. Well, sacred theology deals with our eternal happiness. Therefore, it is noble on that score too. Now, reply to objection 1. It may well happen that what is in itself the more certain may seem to us the less certain because of the weakness of our intellect, which is dazzled by the clearest objects of nature, as the owl is dazzled by the light of the sun. In other words, quoad nos is the expression they use. As far as we're concerned, some things might be not intelligible. They're too difficult for us to see. That's the problem. It's not the things themselves are not intelligible, it's the weakness of our intellect. So, he's replying to the objection. The owl is dazzled by the light of the sun. Hence, the fact that some happen to doubt about the articles of faith is not due to the uncertain nature of the truths, but to the weakness of the human intellect. Now, this is a very famous statement out of Aristotle. It's one of the things that I've always thought was absolutely beautiful. It amounts to this. The smallest glimpse of someone you love is worth all the glimpses of everything else. All the sights and things. You know this. Bob is waiting to see Betty. He might see Bob, he might see a beautiful sunset, he see a lot of things. But the minute he sees Betty, there's a hiatus, as it were, of joy rises up within him. As soon as he sees Betty, the smallest glimpse of something or someone we love is worth
7:30.
more than all the other together. Okay, we'll take a break.
Saved by the bell.
See by the bell, huh?
Yeah, thanks, sister.